going to talk about the important things to keep in mind when thinking of reusing clinical trial data, and of the challenges and roadblocks that could and most likely will be encountered when reuse data. So as my PhD project focused on the reanalysis of oncological trial, I had a bit of experience at this point on the process to request and reuse data. And earlier this last year, with some other people, including Florian, which have expertise and work with data reuse for quite some time, we wrote a paper on the thing to keep in mind. And so all the things that we're going to discuss today are also available on this paper. So what I would like to focus today on is like why we should reuse clinical trial data, when this data sharing has become important, and what are the milestones that brought us at this point. What should we keep in mind, where we could request for the data, and how. So let's get started. So I'm gonna, I assume that most of you are familiar with data sharing in general. So I'm not gonna go too deep into that today, but what we're focusing on is actual clinical trial data, which includes individual patient data, which is the first thing that comes into our mind, which is just not one big data set. It's usually a set of smaller data set that includes every information recorded during the trial. So from patient demographic, study visits, lab tests, whatever you can think of pretty much. But this data, it's very hard to use without a set of documents that come with it. So the first ones are like protocol and SAPs, which are documents that are drafted before the study takes place, but that can be amended a series of times before the study ended. And usually they are at least partially available for the public even before the data request. So the protocol is the plan of the study, and it describes all the objective, the design, the eligibility criteria, data analysis of the trial. The statistical analysis plan instead it focuses only on the analysis that will be run on the trial. And then we have the case study report, which is a document that describes the conduct of the study, so what happened while they were running said study, and that of course is drafted afterwards. In the case of data sharing, we also have an anonymization report, which it's the document that tells us how did they modify the data in order to make it shareable. Because not all the information is available as it was for the original PIs. So some variable will be suppressed, so you don't have access to them. Some will be grouped, modified, dates are usually shifted. And all of these techniques are used to make sure that it's harder to identify people that have participated in the study. And then, sorry, one of the most important document that we will have is the data dictionary. And this is like a big file that contains all of the data set that are in the IPD packages, all of the variable contained, and describes all of the variable contained in every data set, so that you have an idea of like what you can find, where you can find it, which value would this variable take, and how were they modified for anonymization and pseudonymization. So that said, why would we want to reuse data? Well, a multitude of reasons actually. So the first one is that we have an ethical obligation toward the patient that participate in the original studies. Right? They put themselves at risk to advance scientific research, and we owe it to them to make the most out of their data as much as is legally and feasibly possible. Also, data reuse consolidate the existing knowledge because it allows external research to reproduce the results of different trials. And this in turn increase the trust in scientific research, and it's really needed. This transparency and reproducibility is what we need to make everything more trustworthy. Then it can be used for educational purpose. I'm pretty sure that most of us have used a lot of mock data set during our university studies in order to learn how to analyze the data. And then when moved to a real life data setting, we realized that real world data is actually so much more different, and we needed a set of skills that we didn't develop during our studies. Having the chance to work with real life data would actually allow the people to gain these skills and to improve them. And I'm talking like from data people, like statistician or bioinformatician or whatever, but also clinician. So this is really important. And last but not least, we can use it to do additional research. Using existing data for additional research would minimize the risk for patients because we would need to put at risk and recruit less people. And this in turn would also minimize the cost. It's a win-win situation. And we can make so many different additional research. So we could have secondary analysis. So try to answer a completely different question from the one that were analyzed during the original studies. Or we could combine different studies together doing IPD meta-analysis, or we could use it as sort of pilot studies for new studies that would be run, or we could use it as we can use the control arms from already existing data as control arm for single arm trials. Now, this is a tricky application because it's not as straightforward as one might think. We need to make sure that the patient in the new trials and the patient in the study where we want to use the control from, they are comparable, but it's also an important application that we could use. So now we know that now data sharing is widely recognized as important, but this is possible also for a series of policies that have been take place during the years from journals or funding bodies. The first important one was in 2018 from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, who started to require people submitting papers to their journals to also submit a data sharing statement. A data sharing statement, it's a document that describes if and when the data would be available, because sometimes the data is under embargo, so even if it's available for sharing, it's not immediately available. It's usually around a year after. And also how to request the data. The year after, the NIHR also made a policy requiring not only this data sharing statement, but also data management plan for all the studies that were funded by them. And a few years afterwards, in 2023, the NIH made a similar policy requiring data management plan and data sharing statement to get funding. But the strictest of the policies been put in place a couple of years ago in 2024 by the BMJ, which started requiring authors to make all the trial data and all the relevant code from clinical trial papers available in a long-term publicly available repository. So what do we need to reuse clinical trial data? Well, first of all, as in every research study ever, we need a very well-defined research question. And once we have that, we can start looking for studies and data set that could answer said question. And we should also think of the data and the variables in this data set that we need to answer our question. And while these two things sound very similar, and also it seems hard to know what variable would be available in the dataset before seeing the dataset even. This is something that will be asked at the data request stage, so it should be clear from the very beginning. And where do we get the data? Well, that depends on the study, because most of them are run by pharmaceutical companies, but some of them are run by academic institutions like universities or hospitals and so on, or also some research organization like the European Myeloma Network or the National Cancer Institute. And a minority of them is also run by local health organizations, as we've seen, for example, in the case of some Danish municipalities. How to request the data, it depends on the sponsor, because all of them have their own system. Some of them actually made their own request platform, so you have to submit your request through that. Some prefer the request to be sent via email, either to the responsible PI of the original study, or, especially in the case of bigger organization, to a specific contact point for data sharing for the whole organization level. Another really common way is to get the data from repositories. And we're going to go a bit deeper into that because we have different type of repositories. They can be open or restricted. So the open one have no constraint, which maximize transparency as everyone can have access to the data. But of course, this complicates the sharing of sensitive information and increase the risk of misuse, because if everyone can access to the data, that does not mean that everybody has the right expertise to handle that data well. Restricted repository try to fix these issues, putting in place a research data request system, and also making usually the data available through a trusted research environment. That minimizes the privacy risk and also the risk of misuse, because the data request would be checked, and that includes also checking the background of the researchers. The con, of course, is that this process will take more time because all this check will need time. And also this will increase the cost to share the data, because you need to pay more time for the people checking the data request, but also you need to pay for the research environment. And also the secure environments usually make the analysis lengthier and more complicated. So restricted repository might have some difference between each other, but the workflow is fairly similar, and it's usually pretty much what we're seeing in this scheme over here. So the first steps of searching for the trials and requesting the IPD, it's all on the external researcher. But after that, the data request goes through 3 rounds of review, all requiring different expertise and for different purposes, after which the request it's either accepted or rejected. If there are minor issues in the data request, it can happen that the requester is contacted by whoever is reviewing their proposal in order to fix said issue. This prolongs the time of the data request, but it saves the trouble of having to resubmit a request after it gets rejected. If the request gets accepted, then we move to the legal part of the data user agreement, which needs to be signed by the legal team of all the institutions involved. And once that is signed, the data is finally shared. The DUA usually have a limit of time, but usually that's not an issue because you can prolong that. Sometimes that doesn't change anything, it just requires more paperwork. Sometimes that might mean that the requester will need to start to pay a fee to get access to the data. In any case, once the data analysis that have been promised in the data request are completed, the results need to be disseminated. This most of the time requires also that the paper that before it gets submitted for publishing needs to be sent to the sponsor or the platform to make sure that everything is all right and it's in the term of the DUA, and to get their blessing in a certain sense. Everything is described in the DUA anyway, but failing to send it to the sponsor first might create a lot of trouble. So we said we have 3 rounds of review. The first one, it's just an admin check. So someone is going to check that all the requirements are fulfilled, all the little fields are complete and fully understandable in every single part, and there is a publication plan. After that, it goes to a sponsor review. The sponsor should just check that the data request is actually aligned with informed consent signed by the original patient, that the data is actually still available and it can be accessible through the system. If we get the green light here, then it moves to the last stage of the review, which is usually done by an independent panel. And that checks the scientific rationale and relevance of the data request, also the feasibility of the objective, if they can actually be reached, and the qualification of the team. Do the people involved have the right expertise to analyze this data? They also check for not only the present, but the adequacy of a publication plan, and whether members of the team might have relevant conflict of interest that might affect the project. So as we've seen, there are three main stages of data reviews, which are data identification, data request, data access. And all of these come with their own challenges and issues. The first one, which is the one that we will think more straightforward, is the data identification. But identify the right data might not be as easy as we would like, because sometimes there is not enough metadata that describe the IPD packages for us to understand if and where to find the right data that we're looking for. It's easier if we already have an NCT in mind, like identification number for the study or like a specific paper. But even then, there might be not enough clarity in the description of the data available for that study that will not let us know if the data that is there would allow us to answer our research question. Also, it's not possible usually to know which variables are available into the data sets beforehand, or which document will come with the IPD. So that means that we might not be able to know if we can use the data the way we want to. And then there can come limitation from the original data set that are linked on how the data was collected or how the data was stored. After that, we go to the data request process, and the main issue here is related to the delays. Delays can come at any stage, and also, as we've seen, data request is multiple stages. So first of all, not all the studies are already available in platforms and or wherever else. So we might first need to contact the sponsor to know whether they would be available to share the data, even before submitting a data request. And of course, that might take time because they don't have a time constraint to answer your question about data sharing. And if you're asking for more studies at once, it's even worse because all the delay, it has to be multiplied for all the study you're asking. And if you're asking through a platform, all these inquiries need to be answered before you submit the data request. So even if only one study is still not answering you, you still cannot move the process forward. And then once the data request is actually sent, again, there are multiple stages of review, and all of these stages can take time. And there is no time constraint even here for them to give you a feedback on your data request. And once you sign it, once you go to the UA stage, can still have a lot of delays because it requires the involvement of the legal team, which might take a lot of time, especially when one of the legal team requests for changes in the data user agreement template. If the team is made also from people that come from multiple universities, that gets trickier because every single university that have access to the data usually have to answer, to sign the agreement. But this, of course, changes from platform to platform. And then in data reuse stage, which we would hope to be the most straightforward process, it is actually not. So once we get the IPD, we might not actually get enough detailed description of the variables. We might not know which value they can take or what values are actually relevant for us. It might not be clear where the information is stored. So we might know that they recorded all the patient visits, but not where they put it. And this is more rarely, but there can be some conflict in the documentation present, and that might require you a bit of time to untangle, then realize which one is the right information that you should use. And then there are some issues that come from the use of the virtual environment itself, which is usually the case when you usually have to use it when using IPD, because the environment, it's a remote desktop most of the time. That means that it's going to be quite slow. And I'm not just talking about running the analysis. Sometimes even scrolling a document might take more time than what you're used on your personal computer. Also, the environment can be unstable. It's not a given, it doesn't happen all the time, but it might lead to the loss of a part of all of your work. And as the remote desktop is not connected to the internet, you cannot just submit your code to a push request every time you make some modification. The way to get your code out of the environment is to submit an export request, which is very possible, but that requires a person from the platform side to check that there is no sensitive information in your code and your code can actually be shared. Another issue is that the system might not already have all the packages or tool or program that you might need for your analysis. You can ask them to install them, but even if they do say yes, that does not mean that it's going to happen straight away. It might take some time, maybe some weeks. And also, your virtual environment is going to have a limitation on the storage space. And the more complicated your analysis are, the more storage space they're going to require. So this is also something that it needs to be kept in mind. And then we got harmonization issues, which are one of the trickiest points, but they only come if you're using multiple data sets at the same time, because the variable names might be different, or they can be recorded and coded in different systems. And this makes it very hard to create, to code a pipeline that works for all of the data set and requires additional step of first make sure that all the data can talk to each other. It's usually a bit more complicated when it comes from different sponsors. It's incredibly more complicated when we're accessing data from different platforms. So with that said, all of this said, I would like you to keep in mind a few things when thinking of data reusing. The first one is that there are a ton of opportunity for delays, and they will happen and they will accumulate quickly, and that might lead to stop the project. It's better to plan for it and finish your project early than not to plan for it and having to abandon it later. Also, data sharing costs money. Right now, most of the sharing costs are on the sponsor, but some of the repository might ask for fees to access the environment. So that money needs to be budgeted at the very beginning of the study. Also, the more advanced analysis, the more storage space is required. So it's important to try to check also the feasibility of the space required when planning what analysis to do. And think that the more data set you're gonna try to combine, the more complicated it would be, even especially if they come from different sources. Also, data user lack the familiarity with the data that original PIs and researchers have. That might require collaboration with the original investigator. This is most likely tricky because reusing data is not usually that well seen. As data user are often thought as data parasite that feeds on the hard work or all the people that collected and analyzed the data before them. So getting the original researcher to collaborate might be harder than one could think. And as we've seen until now, the data reuse has a lot of specific issues that require specific training. And this training should be should be more than just theory and basic exercises. It should be more hands-on. There are a series of initiatives right now from institution and healthcare organization about data challenges, different type of hackathons that incentivize people to have actually hands-on practice on real-world data. And also a lot of data champions programs have been developed that aim to better data handling, and not just only from public institutions, but some of them are also being developed from companies to improve, let's say, the data sharing part and data reuse. But yeah, we do need all of these initiatives to grow and to multiply. In the meantime, what we did was develop a series of good data reuse principles that I would like you all to remember as take-home message from today. So the first one is when trying to plan a data reuse, you have to select a skilled research team with the right background of expertise. So you really have to think, who do you need to make this thing work? And you have to yield a rigorous and relevant research question, as in every research project. And as in every research project, you need to make your research reproducible. That means you need to register your study beforehand, before you start anything, and you have to make all your data and all the relevant code accessible to everybody. And you have to be extremely careful about the possibility of bias, especially because given that it's secondary reuse, the data is at least partially already known. So we have to try to avoid data-driven design and be aware of all the risk of like harking and confirmation bias, and very, very careful. So we need to identify also all the infrastructure and interoperability challenges that come from the different data sets and different platforms. And I cannot stress this enough. You need to organize expecting delays. And then you need to negotiate your data access, and you need to be transparent in every step of the way, from research conduct and dissemination. That means that you have to document every deviation from your initial protocol, but also every use of the data, every paper or conference poster presentation that you did based on this data. And then there is also need to set up incentive mechanism from the data providers, because until they don't want to share the data, it's going to be very hard to reuse it properly. So that is pretty much it from my side, but if you have any question, please feel free to ask.